calls for all warplanes to be grounded in Syria to save what little is left of the truce there. There have been dozens more air raids around the city of Aleppo amid continuing accusations against Russia over the destruction of an aid convoy on Monday.
He said the damage to the convoy was the direct result of the cargo catching fire. The trucks and the food and the medicine just spontaneously combusted. Anybody here believe that?
And in their sights, Kurdish Peshmerga forces pushed toward the city of Mosul, the last stronghold of the so-called Islamic State in Iraq. I've been speaking to Iraq's Prime Minister about when the battle will begin.
Well, yes, I hope we can do it, and we are intending on doing it. I have a schedule for this. I'm sticking to the schedule. I'm not going to give any information. I want to surprise Daesh on this.
Welcome to New York. We're outside the headquarters of the United Nations here during the annual UN General Assembly. And yet again, Syria is dominating the headlines. And not just that, growing tension and recrimination after Monday's attack on a UN humanitarian convoy heading toward the besieged and embattled city of Aleppo. And today, again, there are reports of an attack on a medical clinic which has left 20 civilians dead. Today at the United Nations, at a special meeting of the UN Security Council, the US Secretary of State John Kerry said that peace in Syria was just hanging by a thread. And there were tense exchanges with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov over who was responsible for the attacks on the aid convoy and how to move Syria forward. We begin this program with this report from our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins.
Monday night's attack on the aid convoy was a shocking part of the violent end to the Syrian ceasefire. American-led accusations that a Russian airstrike was responsible for this, and Russian denials of any involvement, now threaten to derail the entire search for a Syria peace. At the United Nations, its most powerful body, the Security Council, met to see if any sort of peace process can be saved.
Уважаемый генеральный секретарь,
Passions were running extraordinarily high, but Russia's foreign minister said nobody should jump to conclusions.
Many said that it could have been a rocket or an artillery shelling. That was what the initial reports were. Then helicopters or warplanes were mentioned. So I think we need to refrain from emotional reactions and make comments immediately, public comments, but first to investigate and be very professional.
That appeal to avoid feelings and Russian denials were simply too much for the Americans.
I listened to my colleague from Russia, and I sort of felt a little bit like we're sort of in a parallel universe here.
Then John Kerry let rip. In a sustained assault on Russia's motives and credibility, he dismissed Moscow's accounts, including one suggestion it might have been a simple fire on the ground.
The trucks and the food and the medicine just spontaneously combusted. Anybody here believe that? I mean, this is not a joke.
So what do we know about the attack on the aid convoy? It took place on Monday night. The convoy was in the town of Umm al-Kubra, intending to head on to rebel-held areas in Aleppo province. Russia has admitted tracking the convoy with a drone. They say their footage shows it was accompanied by an armed rebel vehicle. Later that evening, the convoy was hit. Those at the scene insist it was struck from the air.
Helicopters dropped 4 barrel bombs, then Russian jets bombed us. There were more than 20 bombs and lots of strafing.
The United States say there were Russian strike planes in the sky above the convoy at the precise moment it was hit. But Russia strongly denies involvement. It says there are no craters at the scene and suggests that somehow the cargo caught fire. But the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, doesn't buy that, convinced the attack was from the air and that only the Russians had the capability.
There are only 2 possible culprits, only two forces that are capable of having carried out that strike, flying in that area. They are the Syrians and the Russians, and we have our doubts about the Syrian capability to fly at night. And so you're left with a pretty strong conclusion, as you'll have been hearing.
The destruction of the convoy and the killing of aid workers has sparked the worst crisis so far in international efforts to end Syria's agony. James Robbins, BBC News at the United Nations.
So at the very moment here at the United Nations, where the international community had been hoping to discuss how to build on a truce in Syria, there is now recrimination over who has broken it. So what chance then of moving forward? We're joined here by the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, who must be a very disappointed man. Is there any hope of moving beyond this tension now?
Yes, we cannot give up. There is no alternative. What is the alternative? Going back to a war, which will be then ongoing without any limit. We had almost a ceasefire. We had almost a humanitarian access, and we almost had a deal between al-Nusra and grounding the Syrian Air Force.
Almost is not good enough in Syria.
I know that very well, you know, but the spoilers got into it. There are some who don't want it. Today was a tense meeting at the Security Council, but I have the strong feeling that both Russia and America, who had been putting a lot of capital in it, will not give up before Friday, and then perhaps we may get something moving.
But do you know who carried out the attack on the convoy? The United States said it was Russian warplanes. It was your convoy, the UN convoy.
I know very well that convoy is a convoy which is led by SARC with WFP and UNICEF food. It was fully authorized. Everybody knew where they were going. There is no excuse for not seeing them. There were 31 trucks. I can't at this stage tell you who actually did it. But I can tell you one thing, you need a highly sophisticated machine to kill 18 trucks out of 31, and there is no excuse for that.
As you know, you have relied on Russia and on Washington, in particular Sergei Lavrov and John Kerry, to move this forward. If there's hostility between them, how can they possibly sit down and move a very difficult situation forward?
They have, in all fairness to both of them, they really worked hard. I was with them until midnight on the 9th of September, when they actually got quite a good deal. I want to believe that those who try to spoil this, and they are spoilers, there are quite a lot of people.
Who are the spoilers, Staffan de Mistura?
I won't elaborate on that.
But there must be, because you have to identify them, so to stop them.
Well, we have identified them.
Are they the main parties to the conflict? Are they the forces on the ground?
No, they are not the main parties. There are people on both sides, on the government and on the opposition, who do not feel that this is actually fitting into their own picture. And they've been spoiling both the Russian and the American attempts in that sense. Having said that, Russia and America have a responsibility. They have to rein in, they have to convince their own partners that this is serious. The alternative is chaos, is war. So I'm still optimistic.
We have heard John Kerry calling for the grounding of all planes, including, of course, Syrian planes. They've been trying to achieve that for so long. Any sense that that is possible?
It is possible, and it's doable, and was part, by the way, of the original plan.
Yes, which did not work.
Did not reach to that point. And the best way to undermine that was actually undermining the second chain of this chain of 3 points. Point one, cessation or reduction, let's be frank, reduction of hostilities. Phase two, humanitarian access. That's where the spoilers got into, because they didn't want to reach point three. And what is point three? Disconnecting al-Nusra from the rest of the opposition and grounding the Syrian Air Force. Guess who didn't like that last part?
Grounding Syrian Air Force. The Syrian Air Force didn't want it.
And disconnecting from al-Nusra.
The group which is said to be linked to Al-Qaeda, even though it changed its name. But isn't this the brunt of the problem, that they actually on the ground still believe in a military solution?
Yes, but they should know by now that there is no military solution. Look what has been going up and down. 1 week, one part believes they can win, the second week, the other one, none of them. The only one who are losing everything are the Syrians. So this is still the best chance. We must wish good luck, energy, and responsibility to both the Russian and Americans. They actually told us publicly on the 9th of September, we have a deal. They must make it work.
And we understand that the suspension of aid deliveries has now been lifted. Are the trucks rolling now in Syria?
They will be rolling because the humanitarian needs always prevails, because people have been waiting for it, but carefully and cautiously.
You're not losing hope, Staffan de Mistura?
No, because the losing hope, which means really betraying all the Syrians who have been waiting for some good news.
But you've seen the mood inside the Security Council. It's really hard to see how it can be picked up, despite the necessity of it.
I've seen difficult Security Council meetings. This was not the most difficult one. I could detect that both the Russian and American, while they were actually being quite tense to each other, they were still giving. Look at the last word which Kerry said when he looked at Lavrov. We still have a chance, but we need both of us to make it work.
Staffan de Mistura, thank you very much for joining us here on the BBC. Still a chance, he says, to try to rescue this embattled truce, if it can be called a truce, across Syria. It's not just Syria that is on the minds of many here. It's also the situation in Iraq, where there's also a battle there against the so-called Islamic State. Iraqi forces are moving up towards the south, and Kurdish forces are now moving towards the east. In a moment, we'll hear from Iraq's Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, about when that battle may commence. But first, my colleague Orla Guerin has been with the Kurdish forces just 12 kilometres from the front line.
On the front line, a tense moment for Kurdish Peshmerga fighters. The enemy is on the move. They spot a car in territory controlled by the so-called Islamic State. They think it could be carrying explosives.
That's it.
But the moving target gets away. The commander tells me that IS are just a kilometre ahead. They've tried to attack us 30 or 40 times, says General Nabi Dolameri. We have defeated them here, he says, and we will defeat them in Mosul, God willing. We drive over rough terrain along the front line, which stretches for 1,000 kilometres. Riding shotgun in the shadows, a fighter who has been here on Bashik Mountain for 18 months. But his uniform separates him from the rest. He's a former British soldier turned volunteer sniper who says he has no hesitation pulling the trigger on IS.
They're nothing. They're it's like putting your foot on an ant. It's nothing.
For you personally, what was it that drew you here to risk your own life? You came from Scotland. This isn't your country, many would say. This isn't your war.
This is, for people to say that this isn't the West's war, you got your head stuck in the sand. If Daesh got their caliphate here, then the next step for them would be Europe. Nice, Paris would be nothing to what we would see. The fact of the matter is that the Peshmerga held the line and has started pushing them back.
But they aren't beaten yet. This mortar landed soon after we arrived. IS were responding to our presence, the Kurds said. Their horizon stretches beyond defeating the insurgents. The Peshmerga have been expanding their territory and plan to keep their gains. They want independence for their autonomous region. But for now, the focus is on freeing Mosul. This IS defector, who surrendered to the Kurds, claims the extremists have dug in for a long fight. We're not revealing his identity because he has relatives living under IS control.
There are many IS fighters in Mosul. They have cars with explosives. They are trying to convert a cannon to fire mustard gas so that when the army comes, they will use it against them. They have full control of the city. They have underground tunnels around Mosul 6 meters below the ground. They have bunkers equipped with bathrooms and enough food to last 5 years.
Back at the front line, a distant glimpse of Mosul, the captive city where IS proclaimed its caliphate. The UN is warning that if the militants decide to make a last stand there, they may want Mosul to die with them. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Northern Iraq.
A difficult and dangerous battle for Mosul lies ahead. In the past week, US military officials who've been helping to train and prepare Iraqi forces have said they believe that the Iraqis will be ready by October to begin that last final assault on Mosul. But the decision, of course, is a political one to be taken by Iraq's Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi. So I sat down with him here in New York to ask him whether he believed the battle for Mosul could begin next month.
Well, yes, I hope we can do it, and we are intending of doing it. I have a schedule for this. I'm sticking to the schedule. I'm not going to give any information. I want to surprise Daesh on this. Usually we give many messages, and one of the messages, we start our offensive today to take up, to liberate all the villages on the River Tigris, so that Daesh will not be able to threaten any supply route from Baghdad to Beiji to Mosul, and this is essential for us now. So we are very much ready for this. So I want to make sure that the international coalition is ready to provide the help for us when we need it.
It's not ready yet.
Well, they tell us that is ready. It's going to be ready in probably some in the next few days. But most of the things are settled at the moment, and we hope we will ready sometime, probably in the next few weeks.
What do you fear about the attack on so-called Islamic State, where it is most entrenched in the city among civilians?
We've been told before that Fallujah was more difficult than Mosul, and some have advised us at the time to leave Fallujah till the end. During our effort to liberate it, it took us only 3 weeks to liberate the city, and it caused quite a huge casualty on Daesh. Daesh just collapsed. We anticipate the same thing.
But President Obama said the battle for Mosul will be hard, challenging, and you need resources. You seem to make light of it.
Well, I mean, this is psychological war.
So you're pretending it's going to be easy, where in fact, in your heart of hearts, you know this could be the biggest battle, the bloodiest battle for your forces.
There are two opposing things on us. I believe it's going to be easy. But in preparation, I have to assume it's very difficult. So I'm preparing things for a very difficult fight in Mosul. But in actual fact, from the messages we are getting from inside the city, from people who are cooperating with us, people are ready to do things here. So I think people are ready. Daesh morals are very low. There are many foreign fighters in Mosul. Their back is to the wall.
It's not just a military battle for your forces, it's a very political, it's a sectarian battle. And you know, the arguments are very public about, will the Shia militia go in? Where will the Kurdish forces go? What about the Iraqi army? Are you worried that you're not going to be able to get everyone moving in the same direction?
Well, the plan which I have authorized, I mean, only probably the last 2 weeks, is, it very much explains the role of everyone. I mean, there will be Sunnis, there will be Kurds, there will be Shia, there will be other minor Christians, there will be Yazidis. This is their city. I cannot stop them and prevent them from taking part into liberating their own homes, their own cities. I cannot do that. My role is to enable them to do that in a very established way, so that their efforts are added up rather than negate each other.
And are you worried at this point?
At the moment, it looks like it's going in the right direction. We have this thing. I mean, we liberated.
Kurds have said that they're really worried that they're not going to be given the role that they deserve in the battle.
Well, probably some people think they're not getting the role, but I think that's good, because if one party believes they've taken all the role, it means they've taken the role of others.
It said that President Obama would like to leave the White House with Iraq, with so-called Islamic State no longer holding territory in Iraq and Syria. Is that possible? Is that goal possible?
Well, in Iraq we can achieve it. I don't know whether the rest of the world can achieve it in Syria. I'm very alarmed by the situation in Syria. The eastern side of Syria is still in the hand of Daesh and other terror organizations. They are bordering Iraq. We are moving towards holding the border with Syria, but what's next there on the other side of the border? I think this is the responsibility of the world. We're talking to everybody, please solve Syria. It's important to solve the situation in Syria.
Iraq's Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, and during his time here in New York, he had 2 meetings with the American president, including a meeting where it was just the 2 leaders, Iraqi and American leaders, discussing this crucial battle to a main assault on the city of Mosul. And as you heard me asking Iraq's Prime Minister, we do know that the White House would very much like to end this administration by being able to say that the territorial control of Iraq and Syria by the so-called Islamic State has come to an end. So Haider al-Abadi was looking for financial support here, military support, humanitarian support. And one of the things which wasn't in that recorded interview there, or that we broadcast, was that he also asked for Barack Obama's help in getting Turkish forces out of Iraq. They have been posted in northern Iraq for some time, close to the city of Mosul. Haider al-Abadi told the BBC that he asked President Obama to speak to President Erdogan. He described them as a thorn in his side. Well, there are many, many issues which are thorns in the side. And let's return now to Syria, which has been, of course, dominating headlines this week with the 2 attacks, one on the humanitarian convoy in the last 24 hours on a medical clinic. The coordinates for both were well known. Secretary of State John Kerry, to repeat again, has been calling for all warplanes to be grounded in Syria. That was part of the plan, which has broken apart. Is that possible? Well, my colleague Barbara Plett, who's our State Department correspondent, has been speaking to Tony Blinken of the United States government to ask him whether that would be at all possible.
Look, the ceasefire, the whole agreement is hanging by a thread, and it's hanging by a thread because of this egregious attack on a humanitarian convoy that was clearly intentional, a convoy that had been agreed to and planned, people coming to the aid of innocent civilians. The question before us now is whether Russia has the intent and the capacity to make good on its commitments under the agreement that we reached after a lot of hard work. And if it does, and if it can, this would be a tremendous benefit by renewing a cessation of hostilities, by getting humanitarian assistance flowing, by getting the Syrian Air Force out of the skies to stop indiscriminately bombing innocent civilians. So there's a lot at stake. Ultimately, though, it's up to Russia to decide. And the deal is this: if this doesn't work, if Russia doesn't make good on these commitments, then hard as it is to imagine, this civil war is going to get worse. And Russia is going to be left holding the bag, propping up Assad, who will be under siege with more and more weaponry coming in, more and more people being killed, and Russia alienating itself from half of the Muslim world. That's not a good place to be, but it's up to Russia.
But all of this is depending on Russia, you say, and the Americans are working very closely with Russia to try to make it work, but at the same time you're accusing Russia or saying that they're accountable for this strike on the humanitarian aid convoy. So how long can you keep that up? So at a certain point, if that's what you believe, then the U.S. will be complicit or in danger of being complicit with those actions.
The best way, the best chance that we have in stopping the carnage in Syria is through this agreement. The challenge is this: these things end, civil wars like Syria end in 1 of 3 ways. One side wins. That's not going to happen anytime soon, because as soon as one side starts getting the advantage, the patrons of the other side start putting even more and more weaponry in. Or the parties become exhausted. That's not likely to happen anytime soon. On average, that takes 10 years. We're in year 6. Or outside powers come together and work on a settlement. That's where we are. That's the way forward. So we have a lot at stake in trying to get this done, but Russia has even more at stake, because if this doesn't succeed, as I said, they will be left being responsible for Syria.
But just briefly on that, at least the military cooperation angle of it, cooperating with Russia's military against ISIS, that must be off the table.
No, look, Russia has said from the start that it's in Syria to go after ISIL, as well as to prop up the Assad regime.
No, we know that,
right.
But I mean, the whole point of the ceasefire was, or a result of it, was that the Russians and the U.S. would cooperate together militarily. Now, since you're accusing the Russians of, being complicit in this airstrike, that must be off the table, surely.
No, what we've said is, if this agreement holds for 7 days, we get 7 days of a cessation of hostilities, we get the humanitarian assistance flowing. At that point, we can look at establishing a mechanism to cooperate and coordinate in doing what we both want to do, and we say is in our interest, in the interest of the international community, which is to go after Daesh or ISIL, as well as Nusra. And that is still on the table, but it depends entirely on whether Russia is prepared to make good on its commitments.
So it doesn't sound like you have much leverage there, but let's move on
to... Well, again, I think the leverage is that, what is the alternative? The alternative is an acceleration of the civil war, and a civil war that is going to harm Russia's interests as much and actually more than anyone else's.
Just finally, I want to ask you a question about Russia. A question about refugees. There's been a lot of talk here about refugees, a lot of money raised to help them, but no commitment from countries to resettle them. So how do you get around that at the moment in terms of doing something practical for refugees other than just giving them humanitarian aid?
Actually, you know, we do have commitments. We have commitments to put significantly more resources into the international humanitarian system to help refugees. We have commitments on resettlement to significantly increase the number of people resettled around the world from all of these crises, including, by the way, by the United States.
But not in a binding UN agreement.
Again, these have to be implemented, you're right, but people have made commitments. We are going to make sure, to the best of our ability, they make good on them. And we have commitments to make sure that 1 million more refugees, children, have access to school, and 1 million more refugees have access to jobs, to legal employment. These are real, concrete things that will make a difference. But ultimately, when it comes to Syria and that crisis, the best way to end the refugee crisis is to end the civil war. And that's what we're working so hard to do.
Tony Blinken, the Deputy Secretary of State, speaking to my colleague Barbara Plett, and his question that's being asked time and time again in Syria: what is the alternative? The alternative to a negotiated end to this war is just more war. It is hanging by a thread, US Secretary of State John Kerry said. But we heard from the UN Special Envoy to Syria say he has sensed that both John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov will go back to the negotiating table to try to get something back on track. If not, look at Aleppo. Aleppo has become a symbol of the suffering of Syria. Everyone knows the suffering. The question is what to do to end it. That's all from us for now from the UN. Goodbye from Elise Doucette.